Okay, today we're going to start our unit on ecology. And this section of our ecology unit is going to cover just introduction to ecology, what is ecology, and as well as a process called succession. So, ecology itself is the study of organisms, their environment, and their interaction. So, ecology is a very large category of study. So, ecology is the study of organisms themselves, their environment, and their interactions with one another. So, the way that more than one organism interacts together. All right. So, this is going to include the living and the non-living portions of the environment. So, it will include everything that's alive as well as the things that are not alive. And of course, we have terms for that. In science, we like to give terms to everything as much as possible. So, part of an organism's environment that is not alive is going to be called abiotic. So, remember, bio means life. And anytime you put an A in front of something, it means not. So, abiotic means not living. So, it's something that is not living. Examples of things that are not living include rocks, water, sand, anything that is not made of cells is not living. Whereas a biotic factor, again, bio means life. So a biotic factor is part of an organism's environment that is alive or is living. And this is going to range from bacteria to animals to fish to worms. So insects are included, so are mammals, anything that is alive. Right. So it looks like let's just use this picture here. So from this picture here, it has water with the ocean with some sharks. So we're going to fill out some things that are alive and are not alive. So go ahead, pause the video, and come up with a few things in each category. Okay, so we're going to go over it. Biotic things that are alive from this image. The thing that I see that is alive are sharks. Now, when I'm looking at this image, sharks are the only thing in that picture that I see that's clearly alive. There could be coral under there, maybe some like seaweed, possibly. There's bacteria in the water. Those are all living things as well, but I can't see them that clearly, so I'm not going to put them on my list. But I do see lots of abiotic things. For instance, the water itself is not alive. In the background, I see sky and I see clouds, and those are not alive either. The water does contain living things, but it itself is not alive. You might also be able to see sand. You can kind of see a bit of sand in there. Not too clear. Sand is not alive either. So there are several interactions or groupings of organisms that we can do. So one individual living thing is called an organism. So an organism is one living thing from a species, whereas a group of living things from a species is called a population. In order to be considered a population, the organism has to be from the same species. So they have to live in the same place and be able to breed. So I'm just going to add here, they have to be the same species. So if I'm looking in my backyard, an example of a population in my backyard would be all the garter snakes that live in my backyard. Not just all the snakes, because there are different species of snakes, so it would be just all the garter snakes that live in my backyard. And then when we zoom out, we can see a community. A community is going to be all the different populations living in an area. So it would be all of the garter snakes, and hopefully I don't have any copperhead snakes and all the spiders, and essentially all the living components of my backyard is going to be the community in my backyard. So the next I have an image here. Go ahead and pause and write down an example of each of the three: an organism, a population, and a community that you see here in this image. Okay, so an organism would be one clownfish. The population would be all the clownfish in that image. And the community would be all living things in that area. And we can zoom out even more. If we were to zoom out one more, we would get an ecosystem. And the ecosystem is going to be all the living and non-living in an area. So that would be, say, my whole backyard, including the non-living things in my backyard as well. So that would be an ecosystem. When we're talking about ecology, we're going to have several different terms that we're going to use. The first one that we're probably going to see a lot is habitat. And habitat is used to just refer to where an organism lives. So my clownfish are going to obviously live in the ocean near an anemone. That's its habitat. Whereas a deer is going to live in the forest. So habitat is where an organism lives. Another one we might also hear is I call it niche. You might hear it referred to as niche, either way. So an organism's niche is going to be the role or position that it has in its environment. And this is going to include how it gets its food, how it survives from predators, and how it reproduces. So again, a niche or a niche is going to be the organism's role that it has in its environment. What its purposes, what's its job, how does it get food, where does it live, predators, and how it reproduces. So everything that it does, its job, its position, is going to be its niche. So, like we said before, the interactions between an organism and the abiotic factors around them are going to form an ecosystem. So the ecosystem is going to be the living and the non-living things in an area. So how the living things interact with all the non-living things. And we can have ecosystems in many different places. We can have them on land, and those are called terrestrial ecosystems. Or we can have them in the water, and those are called aquatic ecosystems. Aquatic simply means water or in the water. And there are two types of aquatic ecosystems. You have marine environment, which is in salt water, and then you have freshwater ecosystems as well. So if you were to go down to the beach or the Chesapeake Bay, that would be a marine environment, whereas most of the lakes around here are going to be freshwater environments. Next, we know that all organisms need energy to survive. Remember, we talked about how organisms get their energy is their metabolism. Just a flashback to last unit. But there's several different ways that organisms can get their energy. So there are more than one type of metabolism. Organisms that make their own food are called autotrophs. So auto means self, troph means feeding, skipping way down, but it'll help down here. That's a T. And autotroph, self-feeding, they make their own food. They're also referred to as producers because they produce their own food. Most producers are going to use the sun's energy to help make their food through a process called photosynthesis. So photosynthesis doesn't actually make energy for plants. It helps them make sugar, and then they use that sugar to make energy. So photosynthesis is just a way that organisms make food, because a plant, a tree or whatever, can't go out and eat a cheeseburger to get sugar like we do. So they have to have another way to obtain their sugar, so they do photosynthesis, using light to make sugar. There are some organisms out there that'll use chemicals to help make its food, and that process is called chemosynthesis, using chemicals to make food. And typically, it's organisms that do this are going to be ones that live in really extreme places where they don't have access to sunlight. So somewhere like a hot vent, no access to sunlight, they're in a very extreme situation. They might use chemosynthesis to make their food. However, so you have your producers or your autotrophs that make their own food. A lot of organisms obtain energy from eating something else, and those are called heterotrophs. So they obtain their energy from ingesting, which means eating, other organisms, and these are called heterotrophs. And they're also called consumers. So consumer means eat, hetero means other, feeding on others. So this is going to be your animals, including insects. It's also going to include your decomposers, like fungi. I know fungi don't physically eat anything, but they do break down other things to get their food. So decomposers are heterotrophs as well. I know that can be a confusing one, but again, decomposers may not physically eat, but they break down other organisms to help obtain their food. And of course, there are many different types of heterotrophs. We can always break that down. Organisms that only eat meat or that only eat other animals are called carnivores. I remember that one because when I watched The Incredibles, there was a scene where they were at the dinner table and the little fast guy was trying to cut his steak, but he couldn't. And the mom said, help the carnivore eat his meat, or cut his meat. So carnivore means meat, only eats meat. Organisms that only eat plants are called herbivores. And I remember that because an herb is a plant. And then we have ones that eat plants and animals, which are going to be most humans unless they select to do otherwise, and those are called omnivores. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. But we do have a few other types of organisms out there that are also heterotrophs, like we talked about decomposers that break down other organisms to get their food. We also have scavengers, and these are going to be things like you see these little vultures on the side of the road, and they eat dead organisms, things that are actively, they're dead. They search for dead things. Those are called scavengers. They scavenge around for dead things to eat. And then you also have organisms called detrivores. And detrivores eat decomposing plants and animals. An example of a detrivore would be like a crab. They go around and look for dead and decomposing things to feed on. Zooming on out, outside of an ecosystem brings us to biomes. Biomes are very distinct biological communities that have a similar physical climate. So far when we've got to say ecosystems, they have to be generalized into the same area, but a biome includes a climate, which also includes weather and temperature. So the characteristics and type of environment determine the type of biome. So for terrestrial land biomes, a lot of the outside factors are going to be temperature and then weather or precipitation. So temperature and precipitation. And then aquatic biomes are going to be separated based on the salinity, which is the amount of salt in the water, whether it has salt or not, or even how concentrated salt it has, the nutrient availability in the area, as well as light availability. So again, the biomes are distinct communities that have a shared physical climate, and the way that they can be separated into different categories. For land biomes, the temperature and precipitation are going to put them in different categories. And then for underwater or aquatic biomes, salinity, nutrient availability, as well as light availability are going to help put them in different categories as well. And we're going to talk about a few examples of the different types of biomes we're going to see. Oops, I'll just leave it here because it looks like you don't have a place to write them. So examples of terrestrial biomes are going to be rainforests. Tropical rainforests get lots of water. Temperate deciduous forest, that's going to be like where we live. You see a lot of seasons. Tropical desert, not that much precipitation, warm. Tundra, cold. Versus aquatic biomes, you have your coral reef with lots of activity and organisms. You have your salt marsh, very, very salty environment, but again, not as much water as a coral reef. You have your swamp environment and river environments. Those are examples of biomes for aquatic ecosystems. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about how communities change or grow over time. And that's going to be a process called succession. And succession is just natural changes that occur to replace and build a community in an ecosystem. So over time, if you leave, say, a field alone, over time, it's going to start like looking here. You can't write on that one. But you start here. There's not that much living there. If you just leave it and there's no human involvement, over years it's going to grow into a big, beautiful forest. And this is going to occur in different stages. It occurs in a predictable pattern with different organisms appearing at the different stages. Primary succession. There are going to be two types we talk about. The first is primary. Primary succession is going to happen as a series of events, growth of an area, but it begins on bare rock or sand. So primary succession occurs in areas where nothing has lived before. So an area where nothing has lived there before, it's going to start with primary succession. And when I say nothing has lived there before, that includes soil. So this is going to be on areas where there's no soil, there's nothing alive, no soil, no dirt, because in that soil there are going to be bacteria. Bacteria are living. We're talking about areas where nothing is alive. And the only areas where that's going to be is bare rock and sand, or places where glaciers have slidden back and exposed brand new earth. So that is going to be primary succession. And primary succession is always going to start with a pioneer species. So if you were in history class and you were learning about pioneers, pioneers are the first to come to an area. That's the same thing here, except the first species to come to an area in biology are going to be referred to as lichen or mosses. Now, you guys have probably seen lichen before. It's going to be the greenish colored, crispy, flaky stuff. It grows on trees and dead bark a lot of the times. And it's often the pioneer species that's the first to arrive in a new area, such as if you see lichen growing on the rock, that is the first step in primary succession. And this growth and development is going to start with bacteria, it's going to start with lichen, it's going to start with moss. Soil will come. The job of the pioneer species is to be able to reproduce, create soil, and make the area habitable for other things so that organisms like grass can move in. And over time, it's going to grow. And the final stage that you get to is called the climax community. And this is going to be the final stable community that's going to stay for a long time unless something happens. So the only time that a climax community would disappear is if humans came in and, say, cut down the forest, if there was interference from weather or fire. A climax community is there to stay, except when something interferes with it. So around here, where we live, climax community are going to be hardwood forests. So the forests around here are examples of climax communities in our area. So if we were to look at this image here, it shows succession. It starts with bare rock, no soil present. So there's not even soil. Then you get lichen, which is your pioneer species. The lichen is going to create soil, make the area habitable for other organisms. Slowly, growth is going to occur until you get to that final stable climax community, and that's going to stay unless something happens to change it. So that is primary succession. Now we're going to talk about secondary succession. Secondary succession is going to be the growth of an area after something has destroyed the one that was there before. It could be a natural disaster or a man-made disaster, but it's going to be the regrowth of an area. So secondary succession could be an abandoned farm. If someone just left their farm, it would grow back. It would grow up into eventually a forest. Or after a fire or deforestation or a flood, the regrowth after that disaster is going to be secondary succession. In this case, soil is already there. There's already something alive there. There's been something alive. If you scrape back the ash after a fire, there's still soil, there's still dirt, there's still something to work with. So that's going to be secondary succession. Humans can also have an impact on succession through deforestation. Humans go in and destroy climax communities all the time, which is going to take homes away from the organisms that were living in the area. Humans also can add pollutants. A big example of that is going to be using fertilizer. Adding fertilizer or driving our cars around, it changes the environment around us. And the one in the picture here is fertilizer causing an algae bloom in a lake. And so it's completely changed that area. Another example would be humans introducing invasive species. So if I go, well, here's a good example. In my classroom, we've worked with Madagascar hissing cockroaches. We keep those contained. They're from Madagascar. Human interference would be me letting those cockroaches out into the wild here and letting them reproduce. Then we're going to have an invasive species. And that is going to completely mess up with the flow of the ecosystem. So there are several examples. Burmese pythons are removed from 95% of the Everglades, which is where they're supposed to be. And it's just when you introduce them into a new area, so the Burmese pythons aren't supposed to be there, they go in and they completely destroy the natural food systems at work. This also happens with plants. There are several invasive species of plants around here. And I think stink bugs are actually an invasive species as well. All right. So that is it for this one today. There will be some practice on Canvas.